The first time they found her, she was lying beneath the dull glow of a gas street lamp, as if someone had posed her there for the night watchman to discover. Her hat was gone. Her face, unrecognizable, the bones fractured like porcelain dropped on cobblestone, still held the ghost of a scream. It was December 1904, in the working-class neighborhood of Cumminsville, Cincinnati, where the scent of coal smoke hung heavy in the frost, and the railroad's iron heartbeat marked the passing hours. Life here was routine. Men at the foundry, women at the market, children in the shadow of smokestacks. But the quiet was brittle, and someone, had begun to break it. They called him the Slouch Hat Man, though no one could agree if they'd really seen his face. A shadow at the end of an alley, a heavy bootstep on wet brick, sometimes a laugh, low, mirthless, just before the blow. 5 women would die in nearly the same way. The police would chase footprints, whispers, and dead ends. And in between the killings, Cincinnati went on pretending life was normal. But you can only pretend for so long. It was the kind of night when the city feels smaller, when the damp air swallows sound and every shadow leans a little closer. Cincinnati's Cumminsville district, rows of brick houses with their shutters drawn tight, was a place where the street lamps worked only when they wanted to. But on the corner of Colleran Avenue, one lamp still burned, casting its weak yellow eye on the slick pavement below. That's where they found her. Mary McDonald, 26, seamstress by trade. She'd been on her way home from visiting her sister. She never made it to her own front door. The constable who arrived first would later tell the Inquirer that she looked as if she'd been arranged for display. Her arms folded unnaturally across her chest, her head turned toward the lamplight, as though she were listening to something. Only there was nothing to listen to. Her hat was gone. Not blown away, gone. Her hair, still pinned in neat coils, was dark with blood. The left side of her face had collapsed under a blunt strike. And yet, there was a strange deliberateness to it all. Whoever had done this didn't run. They placed her, almost tenderly, in full view of the road. A message, maybe, or a dare. Detective Sergeant William Hensley arrived within the hour. Hensley was a man who could smell trouble before it made the papers. Broad in the shoulders, with a coat that never seemed to fit quite right. He had a quiet dislike for theatrics, which is why the scene bothered him so much. "This isn't a brawl gone wrong," he told the patrolman on duty. "This is someone showing off." The body was moved to the coroner's office, where the examination revealed something else. No signs of robbery, no signs of sexual assault. Just the hat missing, and an odd abrasion across the knuckles, perhaps from fending off the first blow. The newspapers were quick to print the grisliest details. "Woman found murdered under gaslight," screamed the headlines. They ran her photograph, a stiff studio portrait taken years before, in which Mary wore the very hat now missing. Hensley made the rounds the next morning, questioning neighbors. The milkman said he'd heard boots on the brick walk around midnight, heavy ones, the kind a workman might wear. The grocer's wife claimed she saw a tall man in a slouched hat near the alley an hour before Mary was found, but she couldn't make out his face. Too dark, too quick, slouched hat. It was a detail that would come back to him again and again in the years to come. For now, Hensley walked the path Mary must have taken. From her sister's home on Kirby Avenue, down the long, cold stretch past the freight yard, where the air smelled of coal smoke and iron, then cutting across the narrow alleys toward Coleraine. Halfway down one lane, he found them. Footprints in the frost, leading toward the spot where her body had been. The prints were wide set, deep, and fresh enough to catch the shape of the sole. hobnail boots. But 20 feet later, they vanished into a mess of wagon ruts and trampled snow. Hensley swore under his breath. By nightfall, the lamplight on Coleraine had burned out. Whether by accident or intention, no one could say. But the corner felt darker now, the scene already fading into the city's restless churn. Still, there were whispers in the saloons. Men hunched over beer talked about the girl under the lamp. Women walking home began clutching their handbags tighter, glancing behind them when they heard footsteps. Children were told not to wander after sundown, and somewhere in Cumminsville, a man with heavy boots and a slouched hat was probably listening to it all, smiling at the noise he'd made, because 2 weeks later, there would be another woman, and this time, the missing object wouldn't be a hat. The second time, the weather was worse. January wind slicing through alleys, rattling loose shutters, turning every puddle into a thin sheet of ice. It was the kind of cold that made the city's poor burn whatever they could find. Coal scraps, splintered furniture, even shoe leather to keep warm. Louise Muller didn't have far to walk. She was 22, worked the counter at a confectioner's, and was known for wearing bright hats trimmed with ribbon. That night, she stayed late to help her employer tally the week's receipts. She left around 9. She never came home. They found her the next morning in a vacant lot just off Spring Grove Avenue, half buried in frost-stiff weeds. There was no lamp here to light her final scene, only the pale winter sun spilling weakly over a wall of brick warehouses. The first thing Hensley noticed when he crouched beside her was the absence of her head. Not missing in the literal sense. Her body hadn't been mutilated that way. But her face was so pulverized by repeated blows that it was almost unrecognizable. The medical examiner would later say the skull had fractured in 3 separate places, each from a different angle. The second thing he noticed, the hat was gone. Again, not just gone, deliberately taken. There was no sign of it nearby. No torn ribbon or crushed brim hidden in the weeds. Hat without a head, the coroner muttered grimly, sealing her in the transport sack. The newspapers ran with it. Killer stalks Cumminsville women. Steals hats as trophies. The phrase "slouch hat man" appeared in print for the first time, thanks to a drunken witness who claimed he saw a tall feller with a brim low over his eyes, loitering near the lot late that night. The police, wary of starting a panic, released no formal description. But privately, Hensley began building his own mental image. Tall, broad-shouldered, strong enough to kill quickly, but methodical enough to place the body just so. Someone who liked the performance as much as the act. By midweek, the whispers had grown into something sharper. Shop girls refused to walk home alone. The boarding houses began installing extra locks. One woman was reported to have slept with a hammer under her pillow. And then there were the hats. Cumminsville's milliners, mostly widows and sisters making a living trimming feathers and sewing velvet, began to notice men buying women's hats, but never with a woman present. A plain brown cloche, a wide-brimmed felt with a silk bow. None ever returned for adjustments or ribbons. The purchases stopped after the papers mentioned them, but the unease remained. Hensley interviewed the confectioner who'd last seen Louise alive. The man said she'd been cheerful when she left, joking about the cold and tugging her hat low to keep her ears warm. He also remembered something else. 2 customers who had lingered long after buying nothing, one of them wearing a dark coat and, yes, a slouched hat. It was almost too perfect, too on the nose for Hensley's liking. Witnesses tended to rewrite memory once the papers gave them a villain to picture. But still, he noted it down. What gnawed at him wasn't the violence. In a city this size, Violence was a fact of life. What gnawed at him was the carefulness afterward, the missing hat, the positioning of the body, the way each scene seemed designed to be found. This wasn't just murder. This was theater. That week, Cincinnati's mayor ordered more patrols in Cumminsville after sundown. Men with lanterns and truncheons prowled the main streets. But they didn't prowl the vacant lots. They didn't watch the alleys between warehouses. And on a map, those gaps were exactly where Hensley suspected the slouch hat man preferred to work. One night, standing in the bitter cold at the spot where Louise had been found, Hensley caught himself listening. Not for voices, not for footsteps, but for the faint, almost imperceptible sound of someone watching. He didn't hear it that night, but 2 months later, the killer would strike again. This time leaving something almost as strange as the hats he took. By March, winter had thinned into something damp and brittle. The frost still clung to the gutters in the early mornings, but the air carried the sour smell of thawing refuse and coal ash. It was the kind of weather that made people careless. Scarves loosened, hats tilted back, curfews ignored. That's when the third woman turned up. Her name was Alma Steinigewig, 20 years old, a clerk in a small tailoring shop on Blue Rock Street. She'd been walking home from visiting her cousin, cutting through a stretch of rail yard that most women avoided after dark. By dawn, she was lying face down beside the tracks. The frozen ground beneath her stained a deep brown black. This time, there was no missing hat. Instead, something else caught Detective Hensley's attention. The killer had left her handbag, placed neatly by her side as though it had been part of some strange offering. It was empty, but uncut, unforced. Nothing stolen, except, of course, her life. The medical report was as grim as ever. Massive cranial trauma, likely from a heavy, blunt object. But there was a twist. The coroner noted bruising along Alma's shoulders and forearms, as if she'd been shoved hard into a wall before the final blows. There were no walls nearby, which meant, Hensley reasoned, she had been attacked elsewhere and moved here afterward. The most curious thing, though, lay in the ground itself. Frost preserved certain things better than any photograph. That morning, the ground around Alma's body held a sequence of impressions. Large, hobnail boot prints, similar to those Hensley had seen near Mary MacDonald's body, angled slightly inward, as if the man walked with a peculiar gait. They led from the direction of the freight depot to the very spot where Alma lay, then curved back toward the tracks. The trail was so clean it almost looked staged. Hensley followed the prints until they met the rail line. There they vanished, obliterated by the scissoring tracks of freight wheels and the shuffle of porters. If the man had boarded a train, he could be in Dayton by now, or Chicago, or halfway to St. Louis. Back at the precinct, Hensley spread out a map of Cumminsville and marked each murder site with a pin. Mary under the gas lamp, Louise in the vacant lot, Alma by the rails. The pins formed a crude triangle, and at its center was the freight yard, a perfect hub for someone who could disappear in any direction before dawn. The newspapers, hungry for copy, seized on the theory. Is our killer a traveling man? One headline blared. Rumors bloomed. The slouch hat man was a railroad worker, a drifter, a discharged soldier, a German anarchist. One woman claimed he was her neighbor, a widower who only went out at night and came back smelling of iron. None of it stuck. Hensley's own theory was quieter, colder. He believed the man had lived here once, maybe still did. The trains weren't his escape. They were his camouflage. In a neighborhood where the rumble of freight cars was constant, No one noticed the one man who didn't belong. But there was a problem. With no witnesses willing to swear to a face and no physical evidence that survived the cold, the trail always ended in the same place. Nowhere. That didn't stop the city from talking. The saloon chatter had taken on a sharper edge. Now women crossed the street when they saw a man in a dark hat. Men began carrying pocket pistols, though most admitted they wouldn't know what to do with them if it came to it. Then there were the children. One afternoon, a school teacher reported that her pupils had begun telling each other slouch hat stories at recess. In these tales, the man could slide under doors, hide inside your hat box, or creep up behind you without sound. The fact that these were children's inventions didn't make them any less disturbing. Still, Hensley knew the real man was far from a ghost, and if his pattern meant anything, he wouldn't wait long before striking again. When the call came 2 weeks later, from a train station waiting room, it confirmed everything and nothing at once. The Cincinnati Union Terminal hadn't yet been built. In 1905, the city's rail passengers gathered in a smaller, drafty station with a vaulted ceiling that smelled of coal smoke and boiled coffee. Porters called out destinations. Boots echoed on the worn tile floor, and a thin veil of steam hung in the air from the locomotives idling just beyond the platform doors. It was here, on an April morning just after 6, that the body of a woman was discovered slumped in one of the wooden benches of the waiting room. Her name was Anna Lloyd, 33, a domestic servant employed by a wealthy family in Clifton. She'd told her employer she was taking the early train to visit her sister in Dayton. Instead, she never made it onto the platform. The first to notice her was a ticket clerk, who assumed she was sleeping off the cold. But when he tapped her shoulder, she slid sideways, her hat rolling onto the floor. The left side of her head bore the familiar, sickening depression Hensley had seen 3 times before. The scene was different this time. No alley, no vacant lot, no shadows. The killer had left her in plain sight amid the shuffle of commuters. The brazenness of it gnawed at Hensley. Here, the killer hadn't just risked being seen, he'd practically invited it, and there was something else. A folded scrap of newspaper tucked under her right hand. It was a week-old edition of the Inquirer, creased and smudged, but the section facing up was an article about Louise Muller's murder. Someone had drawn a faint X over her printed photograph. The coroner found little beyond the obvious blunt force trauma. There were no defensive wounds, which suggested Anna might have been struck from behind, perhaps while she sat waiting. The missing piece? Her gloves. Like the hats before them, they were simply gone. Hensley stood in the station's doorway and tried to picture it. Early morning light through the tall windows. The killer somewhere behind her, maybe reading that same week-old paper. A quick, heavy blow. The gloves taken. Why? Trophies? Or a way to mark a change in his pattern? The newspapers had a field day. "Slouch Hat Man strikes in broad daylight," screamed one headline. Women canceled train trips. Employers sent servants to shop only in pairs. The mayor demanded visible results. The problem was, there was a witness. Sort of. A porter swore he'd seen a man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat leave the waiting room about 10 minutes before the clerk found Anna. He remembered because the man walked with a strange inward tilt of his feet, like his boots didn't quite fit. That matched the tracks Hensley had found near Alma Steinigewig's body, but again, no face, no name. Just the same shadow passing through the city, invisible until he chose to be seen. The Dayton connection reared its head again. If the man had boarded a northbound train, he could be in another city within the hour. And yet, Hensley couldn't shake the feeling the killer hadn't gone far at all. The fear was no longer confined to Cumminsville. Now, it had seeped into the city's bloodstream. A woman could be attacked anywhere, on her way home, in a vacant lot, or sitting quietly in a station waiting room. The killer's reach felt limitless. One night, as Hensley nursed a cup of black coffee in a corner saloon, a man slid onto the stool beside him. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "You're looking for him, aren't you?" Hensley's jaw tightened. "You got something to tell me?" The man smirked, eyes flicking toward the brim of his own hat. "Only this. He likes to see the fear before he swings." Whether it was a taunt, a drunken boast, or something more, Hensley couldn't tell. But the man slipped out before Hensley could follow, and within weeks, the killer would remind the city he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The first letter arrived, folded neatly inside an unmarked envelope. No return address. The handwriting, tight, angular, almost mechanical, was the sort that left no clue about the writer's age or sex. It read, "You watch the wrong corners. The women walk alone where I walk too. You don't look up enough." It was signed only with a crude drawing, a wide-brimmed hat sketched in 3 strokes of ink. Hensley stared at it for a long time before passing it to his captain. The captain dismissed it as a crank's attempt to stir the pot, but Hensley wasn't so quick to file it away. The detail about looking up snagged in his mind. 2 days later, a second letter came. This one to the Inquirer, not the police. It was longer, sloppier, written as if in a hurry. "Why should I stop? The papers give me a name. The people give me their fear. I walk past your men with my hat in my hand." It was published in full by the afternoon edition, sparking immediate outrage. Some readers believed it. Others swore it was an invention by the newspaper to sell more copies. Either way, the slouch hat man's legend grew teeth. Soon, imitations cropped up. Teenagers scribbling threats and dropping them at the station. Drunks sending in rambling confessions. But a third letter, delivered directly to Hensley's desk in a plain brown wrapper, cut through the noise. This one contained no words at all. Just a single object. A woman's glove, pale leather gone stiff with age. And inside it, a torn clipping from the article about Anna Lloyd's murder. The clipping had been folded into the shape of a train ticket. Hensley didn't show that letter to the press. Some details, he knew, had to be kept for when, if, there was ever an arrest. The mayor ordered more men on the streets, but Hensley realized the killer wasn't prowling the main thoroughfares anymore. The city's fear had forced him deeper into the gaps. Abandoned buildings, freight platforms after hours, half-lit stairwells in lodging houses, and then something happened that set the city's nerves jangling. A young reporter, eager to make a name for himself, printed a claim that the killer had been seen boarding a southbound train to Louisville. The claim was baseless, built from a drunken witness's ramble, but it spread like smoke. Women in Louisville began locking themselves indoors at night. Cincinnati breathed, briefly, as if the shadow had moved on. Hensley didn't believe it for a second. One rainy evening, he walked the length of Spring Grove Avenue, stopping to watch women hurry home beneath dripping awnings. He imagined the killer watching them too, measuring their steps, their hesitations, waiting for the perfect alignment of opportunity and risk. Back at the precinct, he spread the letters on his desk under the glow of a single lamp. His eyes returned to the first line of the first letter. "You watch the wrong corners." The next victim would prove the killer meant every word. By summer, Cincinnati had developed a new habit, looking over its own shoulder. The slouch hat man hadn't struck in weeks, but the absence felt less like safety and more like the pause between thunder and lightning. Nighttime in Cumminsville had changed. Lamps that once gave comfort now threw suspicious shapes across brick walls. Every echo of boots on the cobblestones seemed too heavy, too close. The city had become a theater of shadows, and everyone was cast in it, whether they liked it or not. Detective Hensley walked these streets nightly, memorizing their rhythms. He knew the steam whistle at the dye works blew at 8:00, and the drunks spilled out of Moeller's saloon around 10:15. He knew which alleys collected rainwater, which corners gave the best vantage without being seen. But he also knew the killer had an advantage Hensley couldn't match: anonymity. The man could stand in plain view on a busy Saturday evening, tip his hat, and vanish before anyone thought to remember his face. The freight yard was a different story. Here, the air smelled of hot iron and creosote, and the constant hiss of steam masked any smaller sounds. Porters moved like ants, pushing crates, swinging hooks, never looking too closely at anyone who moved with confidence. Hensley began to suspect the killer's pattern was more than just opportunity. It was familiarity. The yard, the vacant lots, the station platforms, they were a second home to him. Perhaps his real home, if he'd been pushed far enough out of polite society to live among the transients and laborers. And yet, despite the fear, life went on in the city's underbelly. Saloons roared, dice clattered against wooden tables, women leaned in doorways with cigarettes tucked behind their ears. The killer's absence made some believe the danger had passed. Others whispered that he was resting, waiting for the right night. One evening, in a dimly lit tavern near the freight yard, Hensley overheard a conversation that pulled him out of his beer. Two longshoremen were talking about a man they'd seen, tall, with a wide hat brim pulled low, who'd been loitering behind the freight office 3 nights in a row, always at the same hour, always standing just far enough into the shadows to be almost invisible. "I didn't think much of it," one said, "until I saw him take something out of his coat. Small, round, could have been a watch, could have been I don't know, something shiny." The other man shrugged. Maybe it was nothing. But Hensley didn't think it was nothing. He imagined that small, round object catching a flicker of lamplight, like the glint of a hat pin, or the brass rim of a pocket mirror. That night, the detective returned to the freight office and stood in the spot described by the longshoreman. From there, he could see the ebb and flow of workers, the glow of the lamps, the blind spots between them. It was the perfect place to watch without being watched. He waited. An hour passed. Nothing. Another hour, and the yard began to empty. The night grew heavier, the shadows thicker, and then, from the corner of his eye, Hensley caught the faintest movement. A figure slipping between 2 boxcars, just tall enough to match the silhouette that had haunted witness accounts for months. By the time he reached the spot, it was empty. Just a shallow puddle, rippling as though someone had stepped through moments earlier. The city slept uneasily that night. And before summer ended, the killer would return, choosing a victim that would make the front page for days. The first snow came early that year. By late November, Cumminsville's streets were crusted with ice, and the air had that brittle clarity that made every sound travel farther than it should. The rail yard's switch engines clanged and hissed like restless beasts, their smoke drifting low over the rooftops. People walked faster now, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the next doorway. It had been months since the last killing. Long enough for the bolder voices in the saloons to claim the slouch hat man was either dead, jailed for some lesser crime, or halfway across the country. But Hensley knew better. Predators didn't vanish. They waited. The waiting ended on the night of December 3rd. The victim was a young milliner named Clara Dietz, 24, known in her neighborhood for her steady hands and delicate work with feathers and silk. She'd stayed late to finish an order for a wealthy client, locking up her shop well after dark. Witnesses saw her step into the snow, her breath rising in soft plumes. Her hat, an elegant, wide-brimmed black felt, pulled low against the wind. She never made it home. Clara's body was found the next morning by a delivery driver cutting through a service alley. She lay on her back in the snow, her coat neatly buttoned, her gloved hands folded over her chest, like she'd been laid out in a parlor before burial. Her hat, predictably, was gone. But there was something else. Something new. Pinned to the inside of her coat was a train ticket stub. Northbound. Destination smudged, but the date was the day before her death. Hensley's mind snapped back to the ticket-shaped clipping found inside the glove months earlier. The killer was either mocking him or laying breadcrumbs he had no intention of letting anyone follow. The coroner's report told a story Hensley already knew by heart. Massive head trauma from a blunt instrument, likely a steel pipe or heavy wrench. No signs of robbery, no evidence of sexual assault. Just violence, precise and impersonal. Snow had preserved more than just the body. It had captured a trail. 2 sets of prints. Clara's smaller, deliberate steps leading into the alley, and the larger, inward-tilted boot prints following close behind. At the point where Clara fell, the larger prints circled once, then headed toward the rail yard. This time, the prints didn't vanish immediately. Hensley followed them himself, boots crunching in the hard snow, past stacks of freight crates and idle boxcars. They ended at a set of tracks where the snow was churned to gray slush. A train had left recently. The Enquirer went wild with the story. Killer returns with winter snows. Fear settled back over the city like the frost. Hat shops saw a drop in sales. Women began wearing scarves pulled tight under their chins, as if fabric alone could keep the danger at bay. Hensley, meanwhile, began spending his nights in the cold, positioning himself at the rail yard's choke points, watching every man who passed. Some nights he saw nothing but drunks and laborers. Other nights, he caught glimpses of a tall figure at the periphery, always moving, always just far enough away to vanish before he could close the distance. By Christmas, no more bodies had turned up. But Hensley's instincts told him the season wasn't over. The slouch hat man liked the cold. He liked the way it kept people's faces down, made them slower, more predictable, and if the past was any guide, he would strike again before the thaw. When he did, it wouldn't just confirm the killer's return, it would connect him to murders far beyond Cincinnati. The first time Hensley heard the Dayton rumor, he dismissed it as a distraction, one of the many phantom leads that sprouted like weeds after every killing. But the second time, it came from a Dayton police detective with a voice as flat as the plains between their cities. The man's name was Detective Arthur Fenwick. He had the look of someone who'd spent too many nights chasing cold air and colder men. Thin, gray around the edges, eyes that didn't blink much. He arrived in Cincinnati on a Monday morning, coat buttoned to his throat, and went straight to Hensley's desk. "We've got 2, Fenwick said without preamble. "Both women, both in the last 18 months. Both look like your man's work." The photographs he laid down told the rest. One was a laundress named Nora Keene, found behind a freight warehouse on Dayton's west side. The other, a seamstress named Lillian Voss, discovered near the old canal. Both had skull fractures consistent with a heavy, blunt weapon. Neither had been robbed. And, most tellingly, both had been missing some personal item, a shawl in one case, a hair comb in the other. But what sealed Hensley's attention was the setting. Both bodies had been found within 100 yards of active rail lines. Fenwick leaned back. "Your killer rides the trains, Sergeant. He's not just a Cincinnati problem. The theory had teeth. The rail network between Cincinnati and Dayton was a lifeline for goods, workers, and anyone who wanted to vanish without a trace. Passenger cars mixed with freight runs, ticket checks were often lax, especially in the early hours. A man with the right look and a confident stride could step off in Dayton, walk a few blocks, do what he came to do, and be gone before the body cooled." Hensley traced the dates of the Dayton murders against his own case files. They fit too neatly. Both had occurred during lulls in Cincinnati's killings, like the killer had shifted his hunting ground for a spell before returning home. The next question was harder. Was the slouch hat man targeting women at random, or did he choose them for a reason? Fenwick's files gave no obvious connection. Different ages, different neighborhoods, different routines. The only shared pattern was opportunity, and the railway's shadow over both cities. The press caught wind of the crosstown connection within a week. Is Ohio harboring a traveling murderer? The Dayton papers printed the Cincinnati victims' photographs alongside their own, as though laying them in a grim parade. The panic doubled overnight. Hensley and Fenwick tried a new approach: stakeouts at both ends of the line. In Cincinnati, Hensley watched the yards and sidings. In Dayton, Fenwick took the arrival platforms and departure gates. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, on a sleet-heavy evening, a Dayton porter sent a telegram to Hensley. Saw tall man slouch hat board southbound freight. No baggage. By the time Hensley reached the Cincinnati yards, the freight had already been emptied. No sign of the man. But 2 nights later, a body would be found less than a mile from those same tracks. This time, much closer to home. It was a reminder that the slouch hat man didn't belong to any one city. He belonged to the space between them, the thin steel lines that carried him like veins carrying poison. And the next time he surfaced, someone would get close enough to describe more than his hat. The woman's name was Margaret Keene, and she swore she saw him. It was January, late afternoon, the kind of bitter day when the light dies too early and the streets glaze over with ice. Margaret was walking home from her job at a hosiery shop on Freeman Avenue when she realized someone was behind her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that his footsteps fell exactly in rhythm with hers. She glanced back once. Just a man in a dark overcoat, collar turned up, brim of his hat low. But something in the way he moved made her keep glancing over her shoulder. His stride was long, confident, the inward tilt of his boots unmistakable. At the corner, she stopped to light a cigarette. He stopped too, 10 paces back, leaning casually against a lamppost. In the momentary flare of the match, she caught it. A pale, thin mouth set in a line so straight it could have been carved from bone. No smile, no frown, just absence. Margaret's pulse spiked. She flicked the match, dropped the unlit cigarette, and ducked into a butcher's shop. The heavy scent of blood and sawdust met her like a wall. Through the frosted window, she saw him pause at the corner, look directly toward the shop, then walk away. That night, she went straight to the police. Hensley listened, noting every detail. The gait matched his earlier tracks. The height, the build, the hat, everything fit. But it was her last remark that pinned itself in his brain. "When I looked at him," she said, "it was like looking at someone who'd already decided something about me, something I couldn't change." 2 days later, another sighting came in. This time from a switchman at the freight yard, who'd seen a man in a slouch hat standing between two idle boxcars. The man had been polishing something small in his hand, maybe a watch, maybe a coin, and watching a group of women walk past on the street beyond the yard fence. When the switchman called out, the man pocketed the object and disappeared into the maze of cars. For Hensley, the sightings were proof the killer was still close, circling, watching, testing the edges of his territory. But they were also maddening. A shadow you could almost touch was still a shadow. The newspapers loved it. Woman claims stare from slouch hat killer. Editors ran crude illustrations: tall man, long coat, hat brim low, a faceless void beneath. Women began describing every vaguely tall man with a hat to the police. Shopkeepers reported customers who fit the look. The city's paranoia was becoming so loud, it was drowning out the killer's real movements. Hensley decided to flip the game. If the killer liked to be near the women he watched, then perhaps he could be drawn out, not by accident, but by design. It would take timing, coordination, and a bait he could not resist. That bait would be laid in Lincoln Park, under the weak glow of the gaslights. And for the first time, the slouch hat man would find himself being watched. Lincoln Park was the sort of place where the respectable citizens of Cincinnati liked to stroll on Sundays. Wide gravel paths, wrought iron benches, the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke in winter. At night, though, it belonged to the cold and the quiet. Gas lamps threw long cones of yellow light that barely touched the black spaces between the trees. It was here, on a wind-scoured evening in February, that Hensley decided to bait the slouch hat man. The plan was simple in outline, dangerous in execution. Place plainclothes officers in the park after dark, with a lone decoy woman walking a predictable route. Hide enough backup in the shadows to close in the moment the man took the bait. The decoy was Officer Ellen Ward, one of the few women in the department, tough enough to face down drunks twice her size. She wore a plain wool coat, gloves, and a modest hat. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make her stand out except for the fact she was walking alone, late in a place the city now feared. Hensley's men took positions along the route, behind benches, near the fountain, in the shelter of bare-branched trees. The air was sharp enough to bite the lungs. Every crunch of gravel seemed louder than it should. Ward made her first pass through the park without incident. On the second, a figure appeared at the far end of the path. Tall, coat collar high, brim of his hat dipping low. Hensley felt his pulse climb. The man fell into step behind Ward, not closing the gap, just keeping pace. It was the same measured distance Margaret Keene had described. The moment came when Ward paused under a lamp to check her purse. The man stopped too, hands in his coat pockets. Hensley signaled his men forward. They closed the circle in near silence, 5 officers moving in from different angles. But just as they reached the point of no return, a group of late-night strollers emerged from a side path, laughing and talking, cutting straight between the decoy and her shadow. When the lamplight cleared, the man was gone. Hensley swore under his breath. They searched the park, the streets beyond, even the alleys leading toward the freight yard. Nothing. It was as if he'd stepped sideways out of the world. Back at the station, Ward was furious. "We had him," she said, slamming her gloves onto the desk. "We had him, and we let him walk away." Hensley didn't argue. He knew she was right. But he also knew something else. The killer would hear about the trap. He'd savor it, and the next time he struck, it would be in a place they couldn't possibly control. He didn't have to wait long to be proven right. Within weeks, the slouch hat man would leave his last known body, and it would be as much a statement as a killing. It happened in April, when the air was warm enough to trick people into thinking winter's danger had passed. The city's streetcars rattled with open windows, children chalked the sidewalks, and women once again walked home without scanning every shadow. Her name was Helen Brassard, 30 years old, a bookkeeper for a wholesale grocer. She lived alone in a tidy boarding house on Findlay Street, her life orderly down to the minute. On the night of April 14th, she stayed late at the office to finish an account ledger. At 8:45 p.m., she locked up, nodded goodnight to the night watchman, and began the short walk home. She never arrived. Helen's body was found the next morning in the narrow passageway between two shuttered warehouses. The spot was so tight it barely admitted two people side by side. Her coat was buttoned to the throat. Her hat was gone. And resting gently across her folded hands was a single object, a silver pocket mirror, cracked clean through the center. The coroner's verdict was the same as all the others: massive blunt force trauma to the head. But the angle of the blows suggested something new. She'd been struck while facing her killer, not from behind. There were bruises along her forearms where she'd tried, briefly, to shield herself. The cracked mirror puzzled Hensley. It didn't belong to Helen. Her landlady swore she'd never seen it before. It was as if the killer had replaced his usual trophy-taking with a gift, or a signature. This time, there were no tracks to follow. The ground was dry, the alley swept clean by the wind. The only hint came from a dock worker who swore he'd seen a man in a slouch hat standing at the mouth of the alley the night before. "Didn't see his face," the man said. "But he was holding something in his hand. Might have been that mirror." The press, already fatigued by the months of fear, seized on the possibility that this was the killer's farewell. "The Phantom of Cumminsville says goodbye?" screamed the Inquirer. The theory was seductive. Killers, like actors, knew when to take their final bow. Hensley didn't buy it. He didn't believe in final bows, only in gaps. The slouch hat man hadn't vanished. He'd shifted again, maybe to Dayton, maybe to another city's freight yard. He'd leave another body somewhere else, and that city would start from the same place Cincinnati had, with a single woman, alone, under the wrong light. But in Cincinnati, Helen Brassard's murder would stand as the last officially linked to him. No arrest, no name, just a trail of hats, gloves, shawls, and now one cracked mirror, all scattered like breadcrumbs no one could follow. And yet, for Hensley, the case wasn't closed. It simply slipped into the dark space where unsolved things live, waiting for the next echo of their shape. The echo would come, in a quieter, stranger form than anyone expected. Years later, the gas lamp on Coleraine Avenue was replaced by an electric one, brighter, cleaner, without the sickly halo of coal smoke. Most people who passed it no longer remembered Mary MacDonald, the first woman found under its light. Time had thinned her into a line in an old police ledger, but for the ones who had lived through those winters, the name still caught in the throat. Detective Hensley retired with the case still unsolved. His desk drawer held 3 things he could never bring himself to turn in to evidence storage: the first letter, with its crude hat sketch, the pale glove with the ticket-shaped clipping inside, and the cracked silver mirror from Helen Brassard's folded hands. Objects that meant nothing in court, but everything to him. Some nights, walking home, he swore he could still hear them, those slow, deliberate footsteps that matched his own, falling just a fraction behind. If he stopped, they stopped. If he turned, they were gone. The city changed. The freight yard was expanded, the vacant lots built over, Lincoln Park trimmed and tidied. but shadows kept their shape, and in certain lights, the brim of a hat could still hide a face. And once in a while, a woman walking alone at dusk would glance over her shoulder and swear she saw a tall man leaning at the corner, watching. No words, no smile. Just the quiet, unshakable sense that he had already decided something about her. The papers called him many things: the slouch hat man, the Cumminsville killer, the phantom of the gaslight. But the truth was simpler. He was footsteps in the frost, and Cincinnati was still listening. Sweet dreams.